Welcome back to another episode of Your Mom on Drugs with me, the son.
And me, the mom.
My name is Josh Klaus, and this is Jennifer Seltzer, PharmD, and I'm just a guy. And we're bringing you our 10th episode today, which is crazy to think. And we're going to do it on a compound called CBD. Now, this compound was brought to us. Mom, you want to tell the story of why we chose to do this?
I would love to. So I had several people telling me, older people my age, telling me that
21.
they were 21. That's right. Forever 21. Using CBD or cannabidiol is the actual what CBD stands for. And also just extra noticing how many dispensaries of CBD are around in our cities and towns. And so it just made me think, I want to know more about this. And so Josh and I talked about it and we thought this sounds like an absolutely perfect podcast. And so here we are.
Yeah, there's a ubiquitous use of it. So we should probably go into what it is and how it's made and all the distinguishments behind that. So, Mom, what is CBD or cannabidiol?
Okay, so cannabidiol is actually part of the whole broader term of cannabis. And cannabis just describes products or compounds that are derived from two types of plants, either the cannabis sativa or cannabis indica plants. If you saw these plants, a picture of them, you would say, oh, that looks like marijuana, because that's actually where marijuana comes from. The cannabinoids are the biologically active, naturally occurring products from cannabis plants. The chemical structure was first determined in the 1960s. There are several most common forms of the cannabinoids. The first is tetrahydrocannabinol, which is THC, or it's the main intoxicating component of marijuana. And it's shown also to have analgesic and antiemetic effects. The next one is cannabidiol, or CBD, and it is considered traditionally to be non-intoxicating and not to have the psychoactive effects like marijuana, but it may have some anxiolytic properties, which means anti-anxiety.
And can you remind me what antiemetic means?
Oh, yes. Antiemetic means to help you not throw up.
Okay. So it's against like nausea.
Nausea and vomiting. Primarily, it's used for cancer patients.
Oh, okay.
And then hemp is, I'm sure people have heard of that as well too. It's primarily, you'll see hemp in textiles, which is like cloths, woven fabrics.
I think I have a shirt with some hemp in it.
Yes. So, and it's predominantly CBD with a very low concentration of THC. So that's the definition of hemp.
Gotcha. Okay. So these are specifically the cannabinoids.
The most frequently noted cannabinoids that we have available that we're familiar with.
Yeah, I remember reading too that in each of these plant varieties, there's like 70 different compounds, but these seem to be the ones that are the most studied or the ones of interest just because they have the most, or at least, especially with THC, they have the most noticeable effects.
Right. So just a little bit of how did the availability of CBD increase so rapidly in the last several years?
Yeah, because I'd never heard of it until recently. I always thought that it was just marijuana had THC in it. That was basically it.
Right. And so it actually I became familiar with it right before I retired from teaching in 2020. I also had a role on what is called the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee for a hospital. All hospitals have that committee, and that committee is in place to help determine what drugs are used in the hospital. And the issue of CBD came up because it's not a drug. We'll get into this in just a minute. But it was patients were bringing it into the hospital and they didn't know how to manage it. So basically, in 2018, there was something called the Agriculture Improvement Act, which was also called the Farm Bill, that came into play. And this bill defined hemp as cannabis and cannabis derivatives that contained little to no THC. It had to be less than 0.3% THC in those.
Because I think for the longest time, marijuana is an illegal drug federally.
Absolutely.
And I think it was just kind of banned outright. And I think this was probably a way to say, well, it's not, there's other chemicals inside of these, the indica or sativa variety that might not be as psychotropic as something like THC.
Right. And there are some derivatives of THC that actually have been FDA approved as medications to be used primarily for nausea and vomiting in cancer patients. That is available. So, so when this farm bill came out, then hemp and those derivatives that have very little THC in them became no longer illegal to sell or to market in the United States. But they are still under the Food and Drug Administration regulatory authority, primarily subject under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, because CBD is not considered a drug, but it's considered a cosmetic. And I'll get to that in just a minute.
Cool.
In Texas, CBD became legal to purchase in June of 2019. Governor Abbott signed that bill into practice here in Texas. So let me just tell you a little bit about the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act came into play in 1938, and it was due to the fact that there was a drug that was being used. It was called sulfanilamide, and it caused poisoning. It contained a toxic ingredient called diethylene glycol, and it caused deaths. And so at that point, then the government decided to create the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And in this, there's regulations for food, drugs, and cosmetics. With the drug part of it, that's when it was just determined that all drugs had to have safety and effectiveness data with them in order to be able to be approved as an actual drug. But for our purposes, because CBD is considered a cosmetic, the things in this act that are that are relevant for CBD are the fact that the manufacturing facilities can be inspected where CBD is manufactured, and that it can be that you can do quality standards for a cosmetic, but it's not going to be like a drug. So because it's not a drug. So there is a little bit of regulatory authority, but not like medications. So
yeah, so it's going to be more kind of the lines of like sunscreen or certain lotions. I don't know if a sunscreen may be considered a
there are certain types of sunscreens that are FDA approved. So but not all of them and stuff. So
okay. Yeah, we should also kind of come into play is like, remember, this is the FDA, so it's the Food and Drug. So we're talking about drugs, but also around food. And it's just a funny little side note. I don't know if it's funny, but it's like there was a time, I think we take for granted how consistent food has become in terms of shipment and quality. Like back, I believe it's in the 19th century, there was a time when coffee just kind of became a very predominant, beverage in the United States. And so there was a massive demand for it across the United States. And a lot of suppliers were saying, well, I only have about 25% of the bean to meet the demand. Basically, I don't have enough supply. So what they would do is that they would stuff it full of stuff that kind of looked like ground coffee or coffee beans and put it in the mix. So you thought that you were getting a whole coffee bean or a whole bag of coffee, but really you were only getting 25% with a lot of other stuff in between. And if suppliers are not required to list the ingredients that they have out, they will stuff it with other things. We're also seeing this too with currently with the fentanyl crisis. There's a lot of recreational drugs, things like MDMA, or other pill forms that are actually being laced with fentanyl, because fentanyl is really cheap to make. And then they can just put it in there and it's actually leading to deaths. MDMA, or also known as ecstasy, is actually not lethal. It's actually the fentanyl inside of it that actually causes the lethal dose. Anyways, this is a side tangent to the importance of having when a supplier actually says what is inside of their product. And so the FDA was created, as Mom pointed out, as a response to say, hey, if you're selling these products, you have to actually put out what is inside of it. And also we have to determine if this is actually claiming to do what you say it's doing. And so the FDA is almost kind of like the police department. They're enforcing the laws that have been set by the government to actually, say, hey, you're actually doing what it's actually doing.
Right. And, nowadays, I can't remember now how far back it was when food labels got put on food. But before, those labels were not on food. So you did not know what the content was actually included in your bread or your cereal or whatever and stuff. And now you do.
Right.
So,
We still don't even know the dosages of that, too, other than just like the carbohydrates and fats, because they don't want to give away their recipe. It's competitive edge.
Right.
But then we have to remember the dose makes the poison. So just like in, CBD, like the THC content is 0.3%. So yes, there is a bit of THC, but you would have to consume a whole lot of CBD to get that high, and probably not enough to actually be cost effective.
Give you that's right. And there's other adverse effects which we'll get to in momentarily. So again, as I said, CBD is sold only as a cosmetic, except for one medication, which is called Epidiolex, and it is FDA approved to treat some treatment resistant seizures that are primarily seen in young infants and small children. And so there, like I said, and it is it used to be a scheduled drug, but it is now no longer a scheduled drug in the controlled substance scheduling system. But anything that has any THC in it that's greater than 0.3%, any cannabis derivatives, is still considered what is considered a Schedule 1 drug and is illegal. Things like heroin, the marijuana, other than the ones that have been modified and regulated by the FDA as a drug, they are still considered illegal. And as Josh mentioned, because CBD is a cosmetic, then there's no regulation as to the quantity in each individual drop, gummy, tablet.
CBD comes in a lot of different forms. Right. It comes in oils, it comes in gummies, it comes in a lot of different ways.
Right. So there is no standard market manufacturing process for it. So there was one survey that found that only 30% of products had accurately labeled content. So
that's crazy. So like you have a 3 in 10 chance of a product that you're buying actually meaning what it says.
Right. Having enough CBD in it. So that you're thinking it's going to be. So anyway, a couple of fun statistics about CBD.
Fun.
I found this topic just really fascinating. I think, I don't know why, because because so many people are using it. And I'm not sure that it has the effects that people think that does. So anyway, there was a survey of 2,000 United States adults. It found that 60% of respondents had tried CBD and they believed in its medicinal benefits. 65% of these U.S. adults polled believed that CBD was safer than alcohol, although only 44% of these people thought that CBD should be legal. This was very interesting too. CBD use broken down by age. 18 to 25-year-olds, 32% usage incidence. There was a 62% incidence in people 26 to 41 years old. 42 to 57-year-olds had a 59% usage. 58 to 76-year-olds had a 49% usage, but over 77-year-old, they had an 89% usage. I was like, wow, that's interesting. We'll get to that. Primarily, people who are over 77 years old are using it for sleep, for insomnia and for sleep and stuff. So younger people are using it for that, but they also have a greater usage of it for anxiety and relieving stress.
And this is this was a study, or this was a survey that was done by Forbes in 2024. And they did, I think, with like 2,000 participants from people 18 plus and over. I went to another survey in 2019, and the attitudes amongst people older than 55 or 65 was vastly different. There was very negative. So it is amazing how in 5 years, like the perceptions of CBD have vastly changed to going from like, we think this is kind of like marijuana, we don't really want to touch it, it is a little bit more hesitant amongst older people, to now of like, oh, this is just an alternative in the non-THC version of marijuana, and it's safe and it's natural and it's cheap. So I think the pandemic might have helped out with that. Just people being at home and probably just going online. I'm like, I'm feeling anxious. I need to help with sleep. What can I do to do something about it? But I was amazed at looking at a 2019 survey versus a 2024 survey and just seeing how the attitudes. I mean, it's just amazing how information travels so quickly.
Oh, I know.
And it can change people's
really
perceptions.
Is. Oh, here, this will blow your mind. So in 2014, the sales from CBD was $108 million. In 2022, so 8 years later, it was $1.9 billion.
Oh my gosh.
In the United States.
That is incredible.
Isn't that crazy? That's crazy. And again, like Josh said, the most common forms are gummies, capsules, oils, and lotions. There are some other forms that we'll mention in a little bit as well. And then I looked too at consumer spending per month on CBD. 29% of the population, this is still from that same Forbes survey, spent $50 a month. 23% spent $20 to $49 a month, and the 34 to 44-year-old age group spent the highest. They were the highest spenders of buying CBD.
Okay.
So, and then 60% felt like CBD was safe to consume. Only 45% felt it was socially acceptable, and then there was also 46% that believed that CBD use would result in a positive drug test.
Yeah, so. Thinking very similar. It's like because THC will pop up in the blood, and
it will because there's just that small percentage of THC in it, so it very well can show up on a positive drug test.
Yeah, another thing I want to mention too is that there was a study done by a branding group. I think they were trying to actually. They noticed that there were negative associations between, consumer usage and marijuana. And they noticed that people were giving this attribution to CBD as well. And like they measured that 4 out of 10 people that they surveyed thought that CBD was just another version of marijuana. They're like, oh, this is just a different variety. Very much like the indica versus the sativa are different varieties. They were thinking it was the same thing. So there's also this belief that these chemicals will provide similar benefits, but as the mom on drugs is going to let just because they come from the same plant, their mechanism of action might be a little bit different.
That is a great segue into the next section, because we are now going to talk about that as far as like how CBD works. So like we said, the CBD is derived from the cannabis sativa plant. And it is distinct from over 100 other different types of cannabinoid compounds. And I'm going to turn this back over to Josh, because one of the things that I learned as we were putting this information together was that we have a system in our body called the endocannabinoid system, which is responsible for. It's a signaling system that contributes. It's throughout our body, and it contributes to things like stress response, anxiety, memory, pain, behavior, and it also is important in the neurosynaptic development of teenagers, adolescents, and stuff. And so we're going to see how CBD and or other cannabinoids affect this system. So Josh, take it away.
Oh, thank you. My undergrad degree was in neurobiology, so I have a little bit of understanding of the system upon my reading. So, and if anybody's listened to the show a lot, I love to give analogies just to modern day life, because we're made of stuff, and other stuff is also stuff. So, I think it's really helpful to really think about, especially your brain, as a collection of musical instruments. And a lot of times you want to figure out, how is that symphony playing? So when I'm talking right now, there's a certain amount of musical instruments playing so that the muscles in my throat are going at the proper rate. So I'm producing sound that my mom and y'all listeners will hear and interpret. And when you're interpreting those, your brain is doing the same thing. If I all of a sudden got hungry or thirsty, there'd be different instruments that would turn on and would amplify in certain parts of my brain and let me know, oh, you're thirsty, you're hungry. So in that way, your cannabinoid system or endocannabinoid system responds to 2 types of endogenous cannabinoids that you have inside of your body. They're naturally occurring. These are things that your nervous system actually uses, and they actually use them in really cool ways. you maybe have heard of things like neurotransmitters and neuromodulators like dopamine, serotonin, GABA, glycine. But this is it essentially is a post synaptic basically neuromodulator. And what that means, most of the time you're sending neurotransmitters from one nerve cell to the next nerve cell to make a mechanism of action. So for example, if you eat something like a cookie, your first neuron, or the thing in the brain cell, will basically flood what we call the gap between two brain cells, called a synapse, with dopamine to basically say, oh, that was good. This was really rewarding. We should do more of this. Your brain really likes to reward you for eating food. So the postsynapse is receiving the signal. Now, what an endocannabinoid is, it is a postsynaptic signal. So it actually sends a signal back to the first neuron and says, hey, stop. Basically, stop making more dopamine. It actually is, it basically is a dampener of these systems, because you don't want dopamine just going on forever. You want to you want to close the feedback loop to let you know, like, hey, we're good. We're good here. So essentially, you have this natural system inside. So when you take something like THC or CBD, these molecules fit really, really well because they are cannabinoids. It's almost like having a parking space that is a certain width. If you have another car that is just that width, then it's going to fit right directly into that parking space, and it's going to mimic that mechanism of action. And actually, in terms of things like THC, it actually outcompetes your naturally occurring cannabinoids, and it will basically override the system. And as if anybody's ever smoked marijuana before, you know the feelings that you get in the symphony that starts to play. And some people really like it, depending on the concentrations that you have. Some people really, they don't. It actually amplifies their anxiety or their paranoia. Some people, it makes them very creative. It makes them, have overarching ideas. And because everybody's biology is so different. And so those chemicals are going to essentially cause different things inside of their body, which makes it so variable. And everybody's got a different experience. So it's really cool that we have this system, and we've basically found plants that have been able to, activate these things. But what we're probably going to, do you have anything to add to that system?
I would tell you that and while THC amplifies the system, because there are cannabinoid receptors. There's a type 1 and a type 2 cannabinoid receptor in that system, in that endocannabinoid system. But what they've found is CBD does not activate those receptors. It doesn't fit in with those receptors. In fact, what they've found is that they may antagonize those receptors instead, so dampen down the effect. Not sure, though. They're not exactly sure how CBD works in that whole system.
Right.
So it may have some effects on serotonin. It may not. So again, it's just not necessarily the actual mechanism is not absolutely known. So.
Which is probably why THC will give you that quote unquote high.
Absolutely.
And CBD won't, because it doesn't act on those receptors. Remember, these receptors are in your brain. So anytime that you consume something like THC, it's going to go through your lungs, and then it's going to get into your bloodstream, cross the blood-brain barrier, because it's very lipophilic, meaning that it likes fatty things. And if you didn't know, your brain is primarily fat. It's all fat. So it basically goes in there, and then it binds to these receptors. CBD is also lipophilic as well. But like Mom said, it doesn't have the affinity for these receptors. So it's going to have a different mechanism of action.
Right. Like I said, there are some thoughts that maybe the reason that CBD might have some effect on anxiety would be because it activates serotonin receptors. That has not necessarily been proven, but that's just a thought. And its anti-seizure activity is not well known, but it may be that one of our naturally occurring endocannabinoids or cannabinoids inside of our body, it may keep it from breaking down, which may give it some anti-seizure activity. So again, there's just these are kind of some thoughts as far as it's concerned. So one of the so in addition to being effective for blocking or reducing seizure activity, that has been proven in some studies in infants and young children. There are some other potential uses for CBD that have been touted. not with a lot of data and not with a lot of positive data. That doesn't necessarily mean that maybe in some of these areas it might not be effective, but it means that we need larger, more well-controlled trials, those randomized controlled trials that Josh and I have talked about. And they cost a lot of money. And so with something like CBD, you think, who's going to fund a study to show CBD's safety and efficacy in pain, for example, or whatever. So
yeah, maybe we should take a little bit of a moment to talk about the benefit of why a randomized, potentially maybe even ideally a double-blind randomized control trial would be a good mechanism for this. Especially just as we highlighted earlier, there's a lot of beliefs around CBD and its effectiveness and its correlation with something like THC or like a traditional smoking marijuana. And if anyone's ever done a recreational drug like marijuana, you do feel something. And sometimes the idea when you feel something, you feel like something's happening inside of you. And if you take something similar to that, you might think that that thing is also happening. And that's kind of my guess of why I think a lot of these treatments or a lot of these symptoms, they feel like will be treated by CBD. But I want to transition over to you to say, like, so why is belief not enough? Why do you need to test and do a randomized control trial? What's the benefit of that?
So that double-blind randomized control trial is the gold standard for a trial. And so basically when you have a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial or even an active control trial, meaning that you're comparing a drug to another already known established medication, what you're trying to do is eliminate any what we call confounding variables. That means any noise that could, quote unquote noise, that could make it look like the drug is better than it actually is. So that's why it's very good to have a placebo arm as well as the active medication that you're studying compared to one another, so that all of that noise will hopefully get kind of blocked out, kind of blocked out, or kind of just covered by looking at that placebo arm.
Yeah, what's some of the noise that you would want to remove? I mean, common ones are like gender or race,
age.
It's like you kind of want all of those even between the two groups. So because if you had like 60-year-olds in one group and 20-year-olds in the other group, you could say, well, maybe it was due to age, right?
Right. And also the other thing too with a randomized control trial is that you pick usually one, maybe two things that you're looking at to look at statistically, that you're going to measure data and show with an objective measurement that something's better than something else. So if we're looking at CBD versus placebo in pain, for example, we want to look at some pain measurement score and show that it wasn't just suggestive that CBD was better, but because we've got that covered with that placebo arm, but that we actually can show by measuring with these tests that actually it could be better. We don't have that kind of study, but it could be that kind of study.
Right, because if a study was also if it's blinded, meaning that the person let's say we have a person in group A and a person in group B. The person is unaware of which one they're getting, right? So
that's very important.
And you tell them like, hey, we're actually going to give you some CBD. And then one person, you're actually giving them the CBD, and the other one, you're not. So both of them, quote unquote, believe that they're getting it. And so you essentially are also controlling for belief. You have belief in both categories, and then one gets the drug versus the other. And you're seeing if that difference is statistically significant, to see like this drug actually does something.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And it would be great if it was double blinded, because then even the researchers wouldn't know.
Triple blinded.
That's triple blinded.
Oh, no, you're right. I'm sorry. I've been out of. Yeah, it's double blinded. Yes.
I didn't even know there was a triple blinded.
There is a triple blind. That's when the data analysts are also blinded.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but yes, if the researchers and the participants are blinded, there will always be somebody that knows what medication somebody's getting in case they had an adverse effect. But so that gives you cleaner data,
because everyone has like a bias and an incentive for a study to go a certain way, and you're just trying to remove as many biases as possible.
Yeah.
Because as as much as we want to be pure scientists, we have thoughts and opinions about something,
Right.
you know?
Right.
All right.
So CBD has been looked at in a variety of different areas, including pain, schizophrenia, social anxiety disorder, diabetes, cancer, inflammatory bowel disease, multiple sclerosis, and anti-inflammatory effects. And it really hasn't been shown to be statistically better or proven to be effective in any of those areas, because again, we don't have large trials. There have been some trials done in anxiety, small ones. The data are not great. Open label trials, what that means is that people know what they're getting. There's no control group. There's no placebo group. So
You have nothing to compare it to.
so they can say they're better, but you don't know whether or not that's just, like Josh said, their belief, or just they think it's due to the drug rather than maybe they're having a better day, or whatever, or you just don't know that and stuff. So,
and we're so good at attributing, whatever we're feeling to something that we did rather than like, well, maybe it's just because I'm feeling better today.
Right.
Yeah.
There were some small studies that showed that CBD might help people be better or feel better with test anxiety or public speaking anxiety, but that doesn't you can't generalize that to anxiety disorder. There aren't data for that.
Gotcha. So it's more better for short term, or there might be some data to suggest like for short-term anxiety versus just generalized anxiety. Like if you're an anxious person.
Maybe. But again, those studies were not great,
Okay.
Either and stuff. So, and the data are all over the board, and stuff as far as that's concerned. So we really do need more data
And this makes a lot of sense because this seems like this industry has, blossomed over the past decade. So it just seems like that we're playing catch up with the public's opinion and their consumption of CBD.
Right. And remember, because it's a cosmetic and not a drug, so there's no real regulation over how it gets used. I mean, well, there's some regulation as far as some of the, like maybe it's manufacturing or processes, but it's not like a drug, a medication where you have studies that show that, it has to be safe and effective.
And
so,
like you said, it's like if someone says that they took CBD and felt better compared to somebody else, as you said earlier, only 30% of the CBD that gets sold is actually saying how much is in it. So even if you compared two different people, you don't know how much CBD is
Absolutely.
actually, if two people self-reporting. So they could be taking very different doses.
Absolutely.
Like when if I told you I drank coffee today versus somebody else, their dose is probably much weaker than mine. So it's like you have to really measure out the milligrams of caffeine and control that of what's actually going on.
Absolutely. So yeah. So we mentioned earlier that that CBD comes in a lot of different formulations. So again, we talked about the fact that it became available in Texas in 2019, as long as it has THC concentrations less than 0.3%. And it is available. The only FDA-approved indication is for seizures and a drug called Epidiolex. This was so interesting because CBD comes from a plant that the formulation of CBD that you take could be contaminated with pesticides, heavy metals, or household chemicals because it comes from the ground and stuff. So you, again, because it's not standardized and that stuff doesn't get filtered out, you don't know exactly what you're taking, so that's concerning as well. It does come with a lot of different dosage forms. It's got an oral solution, soft gels, gummies, an oral oil, an oral tincture spray, a lotion, and it can be vaped as well. So
I actually looked up this as well. It's like, if you're concerned, if you want to take CBD, it is really good to look up companies that have been third-party tested to actually confirm and do the chemical analyses inside of their batch. Like there are some people who know, even though they know that the FDA doesn't require it, they actually do the FDA analysis or their regiment of analysis, and you can go to a lab that will essentially do this analysis, and they actually put that on their labels. So, but you have to do the due diligence and look up who these companies are and what they're doing so that you know what you're getting. So there are some companies out there who are honest, but if you're just going to the grocery store or your local pharmacy and you just get the first thing that you grab, it might be a good idea to do some research to see what's actually going in there and if they're a reputable company.
Right. So we have to remember that anything we ingest, a alternative medicine like melatonin, a prescription drug, or CBD, they're going to have adverse events associated with, or adverse effects associated with them. Everything does. So I wanted to give you the most common adverse effects or side effects that are associated with CBD. They're mostly dose dependent. So that what that means is the more you take, the more likely you will have that particular side effect or adverse effect. Somnolence, which means like you have a lot of excessive drowsiness, can occur in up to 30% of patients. And that was determined primarily with the Epidiolex, which is the FDA-approved agent. But because it has CBD in it, we can assume that will happen in the non-FDA approved formulations as well too. You can have diarrhea in up to 24% of patients. You can also have insomnia or difficulty sleeping in about up to 10% of patients. You can have irritability and agitation, aggression and anger in lower percentages, maybe 5% or so of patients. You can have a decreased appetite, drowsiness and fatigue, just that as well. A dry mouth. You could have an increase in body temperature or like a slight fever, nausea and vomiting, weight loss, anorexia, which means that you've lost your appetite, and hypersensitivity reactions, such as a rash or itching, especially with the topical formulations.
Did you notice in this study that those percentages that you're noticing, were they compared to people that didn't take it, or was it just a percentage of people like self-reported? Was it an observational study?
Some of them were compared to placebo and some weren't. I've got the decreased appetite that I have was 16% in CBD patients versus 5% in placebo. It wasn't statistically analyzed, but there were different, that was definitely higher in the CBD patients. So
yes. And also, just like we can't really make claims about its benefits, it might also be good to notice in people with its side effects. It's like, could have been a bad day, could have been something that they eaten. So also another need to do, the randomized control trials to also figure out the long-term or even short-term side effects as well, and what is actually attributable to CBD.
Probably the most serious side effect or adverse effect that's been associated with CBD is that it can increase your liver enzymes. And, our liver enzymes can go up, and the measurements I saw, or the percentages I saw, were 8 to 25%. So that's like 1 in 4. So elevated liver enzymes is not necessarily bad, but you just have to watch the person to make sure that they then don't develop liver injury. And things that you would notice in a patient if they had liver injury would be things like unexplained nausea and vomiting, or if they have some upper right quadrant abdominal pain, fatigue. They could look kind of yellow, and they have dark urine. So that's just things to watch for.
And this happens when you take it's usually when you take higher doses of medications, or like, I know alcohol, obviously you get things like cirrhosis of the liver. Right. I don't know if that's because increased liver enzymes. I also know with acetaminophen, right? If you take north of a certain dose,
you can have liver toxicity, and you can die from Tylenol overdose. Yeah,
right. So, and I can't remember how many milligrams you have to take. It's a lot.
It depends and stuff. So, but yeah, overdoses for sure. And other prescription medications, you can have elevated liver enzymes with a variety of medications, but it's just that watching to see whether those liver enzymes go really high.
Yeah, I think this is such a good point. I think a lot of times people will see risks like this, and not even just with things like CBD, but even, medications that have made it through FDA approval. And I think it's really key to reinforce that the dose makes the poison. So
sometimes, not always, but sometimes. Well, I can't think off the top of my head, but it's there. Talk away while I think. So, but it's like, there are some medications that it's not dose related. It just may be that your body, for whatever reason, is going to be photosensitive, or you're sensitive to sunlight.
Maybe things like anaphylactic shock when you take,
right. Or that if you and I both took tetracycline for acne, or clindamycin for acne, that I might get sunburned, but you might not, because you're just less sensitive or whatever. So
I guess what I'm asking is like, but if let's say you took half the amount, would
It
you?
might not matter. That might not matter.
Okay.
And stuff. So there's certain drugs that it doesn't matter regardless of the dose. It's just the mechanism.
I guess that would. Okay, this is a good discussion to have. So it's like, okay, in places like that, it seems to be more of your body's own immune response to. So it's like
or mechanistic response to whatever is going on.
It's a cascade that essentially happens.
Yes.
It's almost kind of like a domino effect.
Right.
I guess when I'm talking about with things, let's just use alcohol as an example,
Okay.
right? Like, so there's an acceptable dose of alcohol, your blood alcohol content. But if you go over that, obviously more of the functions inside of your body are going to start becoming impaired.
Yes.
So there's an obviously dose response to what's
Yes.
happening inside of your
Yes.
body. So maybe I should clarify that. You're right. So if you take something that essentially triggers biological cascades, things like an allergen or certain medications, I mean, you can just take a tiny little dose and it's going to put that into gear. But something where it just is dose dependent,
Right.
something like alcohol, it's
Right.
going to be a different way.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
That's good to distinguish.
Yeah.
Yeah. So whenever I say dose makes the poison, think of the latter episode.
Yeah.
Think of things like alcohol or things like acetaminophen or
Right.
Tylenol. And like the more you take,
Aspirin,
the worse the
things like
response.
that,
And aspirin. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, so to close the loop on that, why I was bringing that up, that's so important to do the trials because because if you get any sense of harm, I think there's kind of this thing in the public where they think of the pharmaceutical commercial and they hear all of the side effects.
Yes.
And I don't think people really understand. It's like, yeah, those side effects are there. Actually, would love to ask you when you see those side effects, are those side effects from a pharmaceutical commercial from one of the phases of the controlled trial? Because they're determining toxicity, right? In phase 2,
it's not toxicity that they have to, that they are by law when they put those commercials on TV, they have to cite they have to cite adverse effects associated with that medication. Now, mostly you know how when you get a prescription drug, sometimes they'll give you what they call the package insert that goes along with a medication. And there is an adverse effects section in the package insert. And you'll see that usually most package inserts now have the particular adverse effect of the medication compared to placebo or maybe another active drug or whatever. So you can see them compared. Sometimes they do the statistics on adverse effects in drugs, and sometimes they don't. And the reason that they don't do the statistics is because the number of patients that have that particular adverse effects is not high enough to be able to do legitimate statistics on. But you'll get the percentages as far as, and sometimes they don't do the statistics for whatever reason. I couldn't answer that question.
Right.
But they will note those adverse effects, but it could be that it is only happening in 1% of patients, instead of 25%, but they still list it as part of the adverse effects on that commercial because that's the top 10 or 20 adverse effects associated with that medication.
And they just have to note it by law. So regardless of the percentage or the relative risk or the risk that you're associated with it.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, a lot of times, that's a really good point. So I think it's probably better safe than sorry, just to say, this is the risk that you might be accruing by taking this thing.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And then you and your healthcare provider can make a decision as to whether or not you take it or not. So
whether the juice is worth the squeeze. But so if only like 1% of people get acne from taking a medication, you're like, okay, I'm going
to take that risk. Yeah.
I'm going to take the risk if it's going to help me prevent cancer. Or
right.
Like
right.
That.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we'll move on to what are some of those common myths or boy, I'm having a hard time with words today.
Maybe you need some CBD.
It'll chill me out. Common myths or misunderstandings about CBD. First of all, the first one might be that researchers are not studying CBD, and they actually are. There are data, there are some trials in progress, but we just don't have the data yet. So we can just stay tuned as we see whether or not there can be some more definitive uses identified for CBD. The next one is that it's a proven treatment for many health conditions, and this is not the case. It's only proven for one particular indication, but it's used for a lot of stuff that there aren't data to support at this current time. The third misunderstanding is that CBD is illegal. It's not illegal. It was approved, or it was made legal to purchase in 2019 in Texas. Different states have different regulations. I believe what I read was that I think all 50 states allow CBD to be sold now. The fourth myth is that CBD will make you high.
No, you say high.
High.
You got to pay homage to your Southern roots.
Yeah, that's right. But that is not correct, because remember, it does not act. It doesn't amplify or increase the action at those CBD receptors, unlike
CB1
marijuana
or CB2 receptors.
Right.
Yeah.
All CBD is the same is not true. We talked about the fact that because it's not regulated, you can have different quantities and different materials in every CBD gummy, CBD tincture drop, because again of that lack of regulation. Medications that are FDA approved are regulated, and while they're not exact milligram amounts in each one, they've got this small 10% window, plus or minus, that so it makes sure that you've got the maximum amount, and that's not the case with CBD. Again, CBD and marijuana are not the same, so you can't conclude that they are, and that CBD is safe. CBD is it's not without adverse effects, so just remember that. Safe, and we can't call it safe because studies haven't been done.
Yeah, because like safe relative to
safe.
what?
Right.
And it could be one of those things where maybe there's just overarching epidemiological data, just a retroactive study to see like, if you you have to do a self-report, be like, how many, milliliters of this tincture do you take a day? And then you just ask multiple people and you see the dose response and you see how many adverse effects are associated with that. But I think what would be a lot better is to actually figure out, what those doses are that are safe.
As long as people are going to continue to use it, it would be good to know whether or not their money that they're spending on this is really worth that, So to conclude or to wrap up what we've been talking about today as far as CBD is that we have found today, and with Josh and I both looking through the literature, is that its use is prevalent in the United States, and it's got a variety of reasons. There's a variety of reasons why people use CBD. It is legal to purchase in Texas, but this is something I didn't mention. If you're going to manufacture CBD, you have to get a hemp grower's license, and there's an application for it, and if you're going to grow hemp, then you can do that, but you have to be regulated. So it is FDA approved to be used to treat treatment resistant epilepsies. It does have some adverse effects associated with its use, and it's not considered a drug in the United States, as safety and efficacy studies haven't been conducted yet. So we do need additional data to determine its efficacy for the conditions for which it's currently being used. So
yeah, it's been really interesting to see a chemical so widely accepted and not really have too many solid claims on what it's actually doing.
Yes.
It just seems like a really interesting time to see, is this just one big placebo and that people are just getting benefits from it just from having the agency of taking something? Or is there truth in a lot of the claims or some of the claims that we're seeing out there?
And, we talked about the fact at the beginning of this podcast that in 77-year-olds, a lot of the people are using it for sleep. Well, because it has sedation, or drowsiness associated with it, is it really being used more for an adverse effect associated with it rather really than an indication per se? Or should we have clinical trials that actually look at its use in insomnia or sleep difficulties to see whether or not it's really beneficial there, and stuff, rather than using it for a supposed adverse effect?
That's a good point. I think another comparable example is something like alcohol. Like alcohol can make you kind of drowsy.
Right.
If you a couple glasses of wine, and if you do that every night to fall asleep, you might fall asleep, but long term, like what's it going to do to you?
Right.
And you might raise the risk of liver damage.
Right.
So I think very similar to this, like just because you take something, and actually I'm kind of a big fan of like, if it's not that harmful and you feel like you're getting a perceived benefit of it, even if it doesn't quote unquote work or it hasn't evidence, just do it, because just the belief that it kind of works, especially for things like pain, you just want the pain to go away. And so if you feel like it reduces your pain, that's great. But the big thing is like, what is that doing to you long term?
Right.
You know, smoking can it can reduce your anxiety from your nicotine and make you more focused, but it can, increase your risk of lung and throat cancer. So just asking yourself, is the juice worth the squeeze? And that's where something like, large clinical trials can come into play and do that. So we're in the middle of one big natural experiment,
there you go,
going on right now.
There you go. So, well, thank you again for a great topic and a good discussion.
Oh yeah, this is really fun. I hope that y'all found this useful. This was, for me, it was not just about CBD, but just about manufacturing processes, how we regulate things in the US specifically, and, the role of belief and in what we take and what we think is useful, which are all really important things too. I think sometimes we forget that these things, even things like acetaminophen, when it's generic, has to get made somewhere, and it's getting made in some pharmacy. And sometimes that pharmacy isn't very good. And you have to really make sure that the stuff that you're getting is actually pure so that it actually has the effect that we're doing. So until next time, we really thank y'all for listening to this episode. My name is Josh Klaus.
And I'm Jennifer Seltzer.
And we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.